Many might say that the term Sephardi Zionism is a bit of an anachronism. Zionism, as it's thought of today, is a term that refers to a political movement that emerged in Europe in the late 19th century into the 20th century that ultimately leads to the establishment of the State of Israel. And when we think of Sephardi Jews, we don't typically associate them with Europe. They're thought of as being in North Africa or in the Middle East, and therefore Zionism is typically thought of as an Ashkenazi enterprise. But of course, that's the interest of this series of Sephardi Zionism, is to complicate that narrative, is to show that it is in fact far more complex, and that not only have Jews played a key role, Sephardi Jews played a key role in maintaining and developing the relationship between worldwide Jewry with Israel, both in terms of religious thought, in terms of settlement, in terms of support for Jewish life in Israel, something we've seen throughout the lectures within this series. But in fact, they also played a role as actual Zionists in the Zionist movement. And that's where I'd like to conclude this series, by looking at a key figure within the Zionist movement who was a leading figure within the Sephardi community. Now, before we get to that, Sephardi Jews were playing an important role within the Zionist movement in other ways. Maybe not always as active leaders and organizers, but as people on the ground. Sephardi Jews were increasingly immigrating to Israel, whether from the Ottoman Empire, which of course Israel was part of, but also from North Africa. We spoke in our lecture about Montefiore and his impact, the establishment of the Ol Moshe neighborhood, and the many Moshe neighborhoods in Jerusalem that were established either by him or ultimately under his name after his passing, through his influence, through his support for Jewish settlement in Israel, and that there was a growing Sephardi population, as it had always been the dominant Jewish population in Israel, even during those Zionist years. And the Ol Moshe neighborhood was a major location of growth within that Sephardi community, located outside the walls of the old city walls of Jerusalem, in Western Jerusalem, part of the new city, by what today is the Machane Yehuda area, the Nachlaot area, and has a very rich, strong Sephardi history. But as I mentioned, it wasn't only about Sephardi Jews living there, and we know that after the establishment of the State of Israel, huge numbers of Sephardi Jews will migrate to Israel as a result of increased anti-Semitism in Arab countries that will push Jews out of Arab countries, and they will largely live or move to the State of Israel. But there were Sephardi Jews who also played key roles in the establishment of the European Zionist movement. And that's what I'd like to look at with you a bit more carefully in this lecture. The person who I'm going to be most interested in discussing with you was the Hacham of the Sephardi community of London, of the Spanish and Portuguese community. His name was Moses Gaster, Haham Gaster. Haham Gaster served as the Hacham of the community in London from about 1890 to 1920 for 30 years. Now, there's a bit of a question about, was he technically speaking a Sephardi Jew or not? And I don't have the answer to that. He was born in Bucharest in Romania, and it's not entirely clear his origins, at least so far from what I've seen, but he was a key part of the Sephardi community for decades, and I think in that sense we can think of him as part of the Sephardi community no matter what. There was another key figure within the Spanish and Portuguese community in England by the name of Paul Goodman. Now, he certainly was Ashkenazi, but he was the secretary of the congregation for decades, and also was a key figure in the Zionist movement, who no doubt worked closely with Gaster. But we're going to focus in this lecture on Haham Gaster himself. Now, as I mentioned, he had come from Romania and had received his rabbinic ordination and also a doctorate in Romanian folklore literature, which he eventually published widely on, and was a respected academic. But one of the things he also obviously strongly supported was equal rights of Jews, and it was something that he fought strongly for within his home Romania. However, during times of political unrest there, he was actually expelled for his political activities, and in the middle of the 1880s, moved to England, where he received a position at Oxford University lecturing on Romanian folklore literature. And it was from there that he was identified by the Spanish and Portuguese community and invited to come and be the Haham of the SNP here in London. And it was a role he took up, and as I said, he served in it for decades. Now, the topic of this lecture is not to talk about his career within the SNP, but it's an interesting and long career, which perhaps something we could explore on a different occasion. But what I'm interested in exploring in more detail in this lecture is his Zionist activity. Because not only was he supportive of the Zionist movement, he ended up playing a key role within Zionist activity, both locally in England, but also on the international stage. Now, his interest in what we might call Zionist activities actually began when he was still in Romania. There he was part of a movement that was known as the Hovevei Tzion movement. It wasn't quite the Zionist movement that we think of the World Zionist Organization and the Zionist Congress and Theodor Herzl, because it was a religious movement. It was a group of religious Jews who supported the idea of settlement in the ancient land of Israel, but modern agricultural settlement to ultimately lead to some type of Jewish autonomy and perhaps even eventually independence. And so he was part of that movement and was key in creating some of the early settlements of that movement, the settlement of Zichron Yaakov, which is still a city in Israel today. And so he was a really important figure in those kinds of activities. It's something that he continued to be involved with even upon moving to England, and he eventually became incredibly supportive of the Zionist Congress. In fact, he served under Herzl as vice president for many of the Zionist congresses. And so he really became a supporter of the Zionist movement at large. In fact, he was so involved that there are those who say that when Herzl died prematurely in 1904, that Gaster was one of the leading candidates to actually take over as the president of the Zionist Congress, of the Zionist movement. Now, why he didn't eventually get the position may have something to do with the fact that he was a rabbi, and the movement saw itself as a secular movement and was concerned that maybe being a rabbi wasn't the right fit. Some have suggested it may have to do with his financial resources. Herzl spent a lot of his own money organizing the Zionist Congress, traveling and so forth, investing in it. Gaster as a rabbi obviously didn't have those kinds of resources, and so maybe it was felt for a number of reasons that he just wasn't the right person. But he did remain incredibly active in the Zionist movement at large. He was a founder of the English Zionist Federation that organized activities within England for the Zionist cause, a position, he would become the leader of it, a position that would play a key role in Zionist activities, certainly once Britain ends up taking control over the ancient land of Israel, right, under the British mandate of what was then called Palestine. And it was the English Zionist Federation that became that key intermediary between British politicians and the Zionist leaders. Most notably, Chaim Weizmann, who would eventually become president of the state of Israel. And so it's in that capacity that Gaster, a person who was a scholar and carried himself and was apparently quite elegant and eloquent, played a really key role in helping to bring the various sides together. In fact, many of the meetings with this early Zionist movement took place in the home of Gaster in the neighborhood of Maidavale in London, and his home became known as the Mitzpeh, which means the lookout, but a gathering place for the leaders to kind of plan their activities. And so a really important figure in understanding Zionism. And most notably, and this is what's really significant, is it was in Gaster's home that the Balfour Declaration was written. It was in his home that Weizmann and Sykes and other key figures, both between British government and on the Zionist side, would meet in order to discuss these affairs. And it was there that they wrote the Balfour Declaration that would ultimately be issued by Lord Balfour, that would establish the position of the British government of their intent to establish a Jewish state in the ancient Jewish homeland. But it was put together, the language for it was organized in Gaster's home, and he played a key role in drafting it. Now, I've read that he perhaps wasn't completely in agreement in some of the final language, that he felt wasn't perhaps strong enough, but fundamentally, without Gaster, none of this may have ever happened, both in terms of the relationship with British politicians and his home and the way that he was able to bring together these different groups together. And so in that way, he really is a key, important, significant figure. Now, one of the key things within his thought was that Gaster believed that Judaism was not simply a religion, but he believed strongly in the idea of nationhood of the Jewish people, something that looked beyond national boundaries, but saw the Jewish nation unified throughout the diaspora. And that mentality, that ideology would play a key role in fostering his support of the Zionist movement. Now, it's important to mention that there wasn't wide support among some of the old guard English Jewish leadership in this country. In fact, some of them were opposed to the Zionist movement, people who felt that the rights of Jews within England, perhaps they felt were still precarious, or that there was anti-Semitism, and there would be concerns that if Jews were actively supporting settlement in the Holy Land, that perhaps that would weaken the position of Jews in England. They'd be seen as being divided, or not, shall we say, fully committed to England. And so there was an opposition to that. But Gaster was a strong-willed person, and he pressed on in his leading role within England's Zionist community. Now, some historians have said that essentially he's been forgotten from the Zionist narrative because he didn't ultimately get along with Chaim Weizmann. And after this, essentially Gaster kind of stepped back from the Zionist movement because he was pushed to the side, and Weizmann, shall we say, downplayed Gaster's role in his later writings. Obviously becomes the president of the State of Israel. So really the focus becomes on Weizmann, and Gaster is ignored. It's really only in the early part of the 20th century that new scholarship, new interest in Gaster has emerged. Much of his collections, he had a huge archive of manuscripts, but also personal writings that have now been put into various libraries and universities, much as starting to be digitized and so on, has allowed scholars to explore Gaster, his life, and his contributions, and that's led to greater understanding of the significant role that Haham Gaster played. There's even been a book published about him. I haven't read it yet, but I can just mention it. It's called Wayward Genius by Derek Taylor. I'll put a link to it in the description below, and if you read it or have read it, I'd like to hear your feedback on it. But certainly in the academic literature, there's a growing amount about Haham Gaster. I think the story of Haham Gaster, though, is really important because as a key player within the Sephardi community, he really challenges the narrative that sees the Zionist movement as being an Ashkenazi movement or something only being of interest to Ashkenazi Jews. But actually we find here that a Sephardi rabbi not only was interested and supportive, was a key mover within that movement. And it complicates, or it contributes to an understanding that supportive Zionism was something that had wide appeal among Jews. We know that this history of Zionism is complicated and, shall we say, complex, but to narrowly define it as, this specifically Ashkenazi European movement is not accurate. And what doing so, unfortunately, does is it minimizes how wide of appeal or of interest there was in it. And in fact, that a Sephardi Jew could have played such a key role in it is something which is incredibly important and needs to be part of the Zionist story. And so what we've seen throughout this series is how Sephardi Jews and Sephardi ideas and Sephardi money played key roles in maintaining and enhancing the relationship between Jews and the land of Israel from medieval times to early modern times, right up until the actual Zionist movement itself. And that's really important when thinking about Jews and Israel, that when it becomes too much limited to a specific political movement, it lacks an understanding of actually how rich that relationship has been over the millennia, and in fact the key role that Jews throughout the world, including Sephardi Jews, have played and contributed ultimately to that relationship and ultimately what would become Zionism. In fact, they've even been part of the Zionists themselves. And so in that way, I think to, shall we say, characterize, even if it's not technically accurate to use the word Zionism as it's now understood politically, I think is still accurate in thinking about what this series has called Sephardi Zionism, which is the relationship between Sephardi Jews and Israel throughout the ages, all the way up to the rebirth of the Jewish state in the ancient Jewish homeland. Thank you.